Kirk Cousins had 1 touchdown in the loss, right? 3 interceptions, and the Packers converted each of his interceptions to turnovers, or to touchdowns, excuse me. Is the Vikings quarterback a liability in big games, Amber?
He's a liability in big games. He's a liability in big moments. He's a liability after 4 p.m. He's a liability in prime time. I mean, listen, we do this to the greats even, right? Even the greatest ever do it. Like, you can't win in the big moment until you actually win in the big moment. But the thing is, with Cousins, is there's quite the history here. We're not talking about some new kid on the block when it comes to Kirk Cousins. So, yes, he imploded in this game. He gifted that Packers defense everything they asked for. It was like what Dua did when the Dolphins matched up with the Packers. I thought it was less about the Packers defense, even though I just argued in favor of the Packers defense. Just ignore that film. Even though it was less about what the Packers defense did and more about just Kirk Cousins. I mean, some of those throws were incredibly ugly. The mistakes are there. The reputation precedes him in terms of shrinking in the biggest moments. Yes, he's had some clutch games this season, Dan. I'm sure that's where you're about to go. And yes, this gritty team has won 11 times in those one-score games. I gave them all the credit last week. It has come back to bite me. I'm not going to do it again this week. Kirk Cousins is not trustworthy. Can't get it done.
Spice on the 2nd of January morning. No. The Vikings are everything I thought. They're a good football team. They are not great. Kirk Cousins, I would say this. I think it's a little bit attached to, in those biggest games this year, not only has Kirk kind of missed the mark, but also defenses have found ways to shut down Justin Jefferson in those games. If we go to those 3 games, Philly, Green Bay, and Dallas, Justin Jefferson in those 3 losses that are a combined 78-point losses has 10 catches for 96 yards. So, like, while I sit there and say, well, Kirk's got to play better in those biggest moments, there's no question about that. Also, the reality is Minnesota needs to find ways when Justin isn't getting going to get him going. Or Kirk's got to find a way to pivot off of Justin and say, okay, the defensive plan is shutting down. I was on the Houston Texans when defenses would try to shut down Andre Johnson. And at times, they would. And our quarterback and our Matt Schaub and our coach, Gary Kubiak, did a phenomenal job of, like, pivoting. Minnesota runs the same system as them. They've got to find a way for Kirk not to just play-wise pivot off of that, but also mentally wise go, okay, our guy they're taking him away, and I've got to turn to other people. Hawkinson's got to have consistent hands. There's sometimes situational drops for them. They got to diversify their pass game a little bit more in those biggest games. So, yes, it's fair that Kirk is going to be a little bit of a liability in those premier big-time games until he proves otherwise. For a 2 or 3 game stretch, everyone's going to go to, well, he beat New Orleans on the road in the playoffs a couple years ago. There is no doubt about that. But 2 or 3 games in a row is, I think, what people are expecting out of Kirk Cousins. Minnesota's a good football team, but they have to figure out a way to play great football when it's needed against these NFC playoff teams in the next couple weeks.
Yeah, for me, I think he's going to be he's a liability. But the thing is about Kirk Cousins, when he's on, he's on. When things start to derail, they really derail. And we had a good showing of that yesterday versus the Green Bay Packers. We got to remember, Kirk Cousins in his playoff career is 1-3 in playoff games. And that one win coming against the New Orleans Saints that you just mentioned, Dan. But also, you look at the big games this year versus the Eagles, right, versus the Cowboys. And this Packers game was a big one, but the simple fact that you still had an opportunity to play for the 1 seed and the 2 seed. And you laid the egg that you laid against the Green Bay Packers at Lambeau Field in Green Bay. But in those 3 games, versus the Eagles, Kirk Cousins has 3 interceptions. Versus the Cowboys, he's 12 for 23 for 105 yards. Yesterday versus the Green Bay Packers, he has 4 turnovers, 3 interceptions, and then 1 fumble, 1 return for a pick 6. You can't have your quarterback playing that way or having these turnovers in games that are meaningful against these type of opponents.
What is your expectation of who or what Kirk is? Do you think Kirk is a top 6 guy, or do you think he's a top 12 player at the position?
No,
that's what matters here in this conversation.
Guy for me.
I mean, he's a quarterback that's on a 12-win team this season, though, right? I mean, arguably one of the best teams in the NFL all season long, and they have been dominant. So, yes, I actually agree with you, Dan. Like, the expectation moves here. The goalpost moves. We're not talking about can Kirk Cousins win, a regular season game and be clutch in that moment, which he has done this season, like I said. I mean, we are talking about come-from-behind performances. We're talking about very close games for this Vikings team. He has been clutch. He has had those moments. We're talking about can he do it when the lights are the brightest. And what Harry just did was rattle off a whole list of Kirk Cousins' lack of accomplishments in those moments. And that's the point. Yes, we do this to everybody until they win the big one, except for with Kirk Cousins, there is a huge history of opportunities he's had to prove us wrong, and he's failed to do so.
All right, Kirk Cousins was picked off 3 times on passes of 10 or more air yards on Sunday. So he now has a league-leading 11 interceptions on those throws this season.
Oh, my gosh.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming, sports, and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.